So let's move on. Becomes very complex. Let's look at another angle of the story. Chartered accountant watchdog Saica is taking action against accountants implicated in this looting scandal. To discuss this further, we're joined by accountant, social activist, and you've seen him on this program before, Kai Satoli. A very good afternoon to you and welcome. When you hear the lawyer for Sipho Malaba saying that the client felt aggrieved, that bits were left out of the report, maybe the starting point is there general acceptance among the accounting profession as to the veracity of this report? Do you accept its bona fides?
I think the industry has taken the report at face value, because what you are seeing here is that this report was commissioned by the Reserve Bank, and of course for them, they would have been very adamant that the information that makes its way into this particular report is based on information that is verifiable and accurate, because of course the risk to them of them losing credibility if a challenge like Malaba succeeds on the basis that they misinterpreted information will be very great for the Reserve Bank. So I do think that on face value we are taking the information as it is. I'm
not asking you specifically to comment on the interview that we've just had, but when reference is made to this report being biased, for instance, that there was a preconceived or a preconsidered outcome, would you suggest that that's a bit of an overreach?
I think obviously the bias by a person who's trying to defend themselves is always going to be try and criticize the process that led to them being, I don't want to say convicted, but for them being accused of such a crime. So, of course, it is natural for Malaba's lawyer to say that they think the process was biased. Now, whether there was a predetermined outcome, I don't think that's accurate, because the reality here is that you had the curator who did the initial sort of, trying to find out what's happening here. And on the basis of the curator's report, then the investigation was initiated. So unless he's alleging that everybody's colluding towards essentially damning him, I don't think there's much merit in him saying that there was a predetermined outcome.
But inevitable that people are going to put their best foot forward, and they're going to fight as hard as they possibly can. Just for the record again, remind us what Saica is. Who do you represent?
Now, Saica is the South African Institute of Chartered Accountants.
So that's the overall overarching sort of regulatory body as far as...
No, I wouldn't call what they do regulation. It's essentially a private members club. So once you've qualified as a CA, you can then decide that you want to be a member of Saica. And of course, that then means that you then might be bound by their codes and whatever their disciplinary processes are. So what the process is here now is that obviously for them, they don't want to be associated with members of this KPMG audit that is now turned out. So what they will then do is essentially try to establish whether those members should still be associated with the Saica brand. So that's really the process that that's going to play out.
In fairness, is Saica not jumping the gun, instituting disciplinary action against 8 of its members? Again, let's bear in mind that this report itself is simply one that is making recommendations. It's followed the numbers, the crumbs, so to speak. Would it not be better for the organization to wait until an investigation is completed?
The reality, of course, is that they don't have the powers to actually do a proper investigation themselves, because they simply rely on the byproduct of other investigating agencies. So what will happen here is that they might have issued the statement now that they're going to institute disciplinary proceedings, but if a person like Malaba is challenging this report, then there's actually nothing for them to start on. So I do think that all they did was simply cover their PR by saying that we intend on doing something, but there's not much for them to start with.
So why would they be doing it in the first place? As you say, just to be seen to be acting enough?
Yeah, there's been the public perception that they're far too silent on these matters, that they're far too invisible when people associated with their brand get sort of accused of these particular crimes. So for them, it was important for them to put up a particular position, but literally it stands right now, Malaba is not going to be stressing about what Saica might do, because he still has to sort out his own matter, and only once he gets convicted can they possibly have something to use as a starting point to say, okay, now that you've been convicted of a crime, here's how we're going to proceed.
I'm glad you raised the issue of silence, though, because this is not the first time that the accounting profession has been caught with its hand in the ringer, so to speak. This particular issue, again, within the realms of allegation, also points to problems possibly of ethics within the accounting profession. What's wrong?
I suppose the problem with the accounting profession is that it is a subset of society at large, and we've seen that perhaps society at large has been really on a downward spiral when it comes to matters of ethics, and you see perhaps how our politicians conduct themselves. And I always say that how our politicians conduct themselves is a reflection of us, because essentially these politicians emerge from this society, so it's not like they live in a parallel vacuum. So I do think that perhaps we need to have a broader conversation about social ethics, because the individuals that end up being implicated here are part of a broader society that raised them. And perhaps it was this society that failed to infuse in them these ethics and these principles of ethics.
It's a terrible indictment, though, because one has an expectation that people in the legal profession, in the auditing and accounting profession, the medical profession, are perhaps above board, that there's a certain degree of propriety as far as they're concerned.
I know. I mean, when you look at the medical professionals, they sign the Hippocratic Oath, and we'd like to believe that most of them will stick to it. Legal professionals, similarly, would want to sort of not taint their own profession. But again, the problem is that we're dealing with individuals here and human beings, and when in instances where greed creeps in, people tend to forget that they have to protect a bigger brand, and there is something much bigger than them that needs to be preserved. And I think that it's unfortunate that we end up here, but of course we cannot police human beings. All you can do is sort of give guidelines and hope that people stick to them. But when they deviate, this is where we end up.
But given the prevailing sentiment, as you point out, in society right now, those guidelines are simply kicked into the gutter, aren't they?
It looks like those guidelines are either easy to ignore, or perhaps the ways in which we monitor people's compliance with those guidelines is what is lacking. And perhaps that's what the auditing profession needs to engage on.
So what does it need to do? I mean, how does the auditing profession win back the trust deficit?
Yeah, it's going to take a while. And I suppose one of the big steps is for them to sort of try and bridge the gap between what the public thinks the auditing profession about and what it really is about. And one of the even most glaring gaps is even the understanding what an audit does. So of course, when issues of this nature comes out, this is something that you're probably going to pick up when you're doing a forensic investigation. Now, of course, audit by their definition, assurance audits do not necessarily have the forensic mindset in mind. So of course, when issues like this come up, people always then gravitate towards saying, where were the auditors? So I think that gap between what people think auditors do and what they actually do needs to be addressed. Or alternatively, we need to then go back to the shareholders and say, look, it appears that the auditing scope needs to be altered so that perhaps the way we look at things and the scale and the depth in which we investigate transactions during an audit is much more widened, so that perhaps we can minimize the risk of things being left out.
I'm not looking for an accountancy 101 lecture, but this is important about exactly what auditors do. So one of the allegations is giving an unqualified audit opinion despite knowing that the financial statements were misstated. What's an unqualified audit opinion?
An unqualified audit opinion is one that says everything is well, everything is kosher.
So that's a big thumbs up.
That's a good thing, an unqualified audit opinion. I know that in the past we've had some government department that got a qualified opinion and thought that a qualification was a good thing. But no, a qualification is a bad thing. So in a qualification, the auditor would say, look, I've looked at the numbers, but I think there is a problem in this particular area or in this particular issue. So therefore, this disclaimer, as it were, is essentially what amounts to a qualification. So everybody wants to have an unqualified and a clean audit opinion. And this is what was given to VBS, unfortunately.
So an unqualified audit opinion, he knew allegedly that the financial statements were misstated, but yet, whether it's him or anybody else, it would seem to be quite easy to fudge it.
Well, it shouldn't be easy to fudge it. And what you want here is people to exercise something called professional skepticism. Now, what that does is that in spite of the fact that you are my client and you and I engage cordially, I need to assume that everything that you tell me needs to be interrogated and corroborated by another source. So we call that professional skepticism. So what then happens with professional skepticism is that you can say to me that you do own this car, and I'll say, yes, I do believe that you own the car. I've seen you driving the car, but I'm still going to ask your bank manager whether he really has bought this car. So it really just provides additional assurance, and that's why essentially audits are referred to as assurance. So I think when you sort of have that level of professional skepticism, it is easy for you to pick up when misrepresentations are made.
What about the role of the audit firm itself in policing its own staff? So 10th of August 2017, again the report suggests that he paid 1.5 million rand for a Land Rover Discovery. Nice vehicle if you can get it. On the same day, he paid 1.4 million rand to Oxford University for tuition fees for an MBA that he'd enrolled in. Good that you're chasing an MBA. Another transaction was a repayment of some 2.2 million rand to KPMG in respect of a loan granted to him. Surely within the organization itself, when you see these spikes in expense, I think government refers to them as lifestyle audits. Someone within that organization, it doesn't matter what his seniority was, should have raised a red flag. What happens then within audit firms themselves that allows this kind of alleged behavior to happen?
The one example I'm going to give you is how banks deal with it. So a bank, when you work for them, some of the banks will insist that you must bank with them. And when you bank with that institution, it means that easy for them to pick up that the cash flows in your bank account do not match the salary that they're paying you. So it's very easy for an institution like a bank because they've got first-hand access to information. When you look at an auditing firm, unfortunately, the auditing firm only knows the cash flows that they personally, that they directly engage in you with. So if they pay your salary, they'll know how much that is. If they've given you a loan, they will know how much that is. So in an instance like Malaba's case, KPMG would have struggled to pick up that he's got this additional sort of, cash injections unless he was explicit in maybe showing up with a Ferrari and an Aston Martin on the same day. So it is a bit difficult for auditing firms.
Just a quick one. There was a suggestion raised yesterday on this program that maybe going forward you need more than one auditing firm to look at an organization, a big organization such as a bank. That doesn't really happen. One auditing firm is normally the norm, isn't it?
Yeah, except for the big commercial banks. And one of the key issues here is, remember, this was a mutual bank. And one of the big distinctions between mutual banks and commercial banks is really the cost of compliance. Now, if you look at a small bank in Venda being opened in 1982, and for me to then say, oh, you need to have 2 auditing firms, and knowing the cost that is associated with retaining auditing firms, it becomes a burden for smaller institutions to have more than one audit firm. So it is only mandated for the big 4 commercial banks or big 5 commercial banks simply because of the risk profile associated with them. So for VBS, unfortunately, you don't have those regulations. And if we did, it might simply make the cost of doing business for banks outside the big ones very, very burdensome.
Fair point, but perhaps the rules need to change given this precedent that's now been set.
Yeah, but what that will do, it will simply pass on the cost of doing business onto the end consumer. So, of course, then the cost of banking escalates for you and I.
It's a conundrum. Kai Sithole, thank you very much indeed. Let's stay with the story. Limpopo Premier Stanley Matabata says the ANC in the province is carrying out its own forensic investigation into VBS Bank. Senior party officials are implicated in the looting of around R2 billion.